Welcome back, everybody from around the planet who are joining us today for our International Day of Education. The morning was an incredible view, global, local, focusing on the future. This afternoon, we're going to talk about some of the really important parts of international education, about exchanges, some of the things that are crucial but have been dramatically impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, but they've also brought out some of the most creative, some extraordinary new ideas and innovations. Our first guest and one of my favorite everyday reads is a long-time international education columnist for the Chronicle of Education. Karin Fischer also has a newsletter, Latitudes, which I want to really recommend to all of you. We'll get to that later. But Karin joining us today by Zoom, and it's a fantastic opportunity and a great privilege, Karin, to have you speaking with us today. Let's get right to it. You've been watching international education, students coming and going. It's a very big part of how we connect with the world, and COVID has had a big impact. What did you see, and how did people react?
Well, thanks first, Mark, for asking me here today. You're right. I mean, I think in some ways international education was kind of the warning sign. We saw COVID's impact beginning to unfold around the globe, I think, before most Americans thought it would ever be something that would affect our lives so dramatically. It's had an impact in a number of ways. In terms of international student mobility, it's pretty much just ground to a halt. Most incoming students were not able to travel to the United States to study this year. They couldn't get visas, there were travel restrictions. And so many of them either took a year off or are studying remotely. And that is, I think, a big loss for universities. It's also had an effect on Americans going overseas. Colleges and study abroad groups had to scramble and pull back students from all over the world back last March. And most of those students have not been able to travel either. And so, and then it's also had a number of impacts just in terms of research and collaboration, because American higher education isn't an island. It works with universities around the world in so many ways, and that's just I wouldn't say it's not been happening, but it's certainly been happening in different ways this past year.
Well, I know when we began to first hear it, one of the kind of voices that was calling this out as something we need to think about were the many, many high-tech companies here in Minnesota, but really all over the planet, who have come to depend on the internationalization of scholarship, of research, scientific and engineering. Is this going to be the kind of thing that has a long tail that we'll be looking back and saying, we had a big break there in the middle of some research or the flow of students? Is this going to be something that we'll need to be taking into consideration going forward?
I do think it will have some impact. I think the question is the magnitude of it. Mm-hmm. I think that certainly we, as I said, we've seen just this sort of halt to travel and mobility and international, and to people traveling across borders to study. I think the real hope that people have is that there is just pent-up demand, mm-hmm. and that when things resume, when we can travel, when visas are processed, that, the students will want to come here, the researchers will want to come here, that Americans will want to go abroad. I think the real question is, does it have a lasting impact, maybe even in ways we can't quite anticipate now? I think one of the things people will say to me, oh, look, say, for example, at 9/11, or look even at earlier pandemics like SARS or MERS, there were rebounds, say, in international students coming to the United States, and pretty quickly, in fact. But is this different in some way? Do people become more accustomed to studying online, and does that change their habits? Do they think about studying closer to home? Are parents more skittish? And I think one of the big questions is, the perception of how America handled COVID, does that change how the willingness of students to come? Does it change does it make parents think twice about how safe they feel sending their sons or daughters overseas? I mean, at the minimum, I think we're going to have a year and a half, maybe even 2 years break in this mobility. But is it longer term? And I'm speaking, I guess, and I'll stop in a second here, but mostly in the negative sense. But is there ways, as you suggested in your intro, that this leads to innovation and that it changes things, but in positive ways?
Yes. We've been finding this in some other aspects of education where you can reach people, you can have interactions, many of the things that, maybe it took the shock of the sudden change. But for those of us who read you religiously, we know the reporting that you've done about, the difficulties for things like getting visas and some of the other barriers, some of the elements of our national policy. So there was difficulty, then there was COVID and all of the elements of pandemic, including the economic impacts, of course. Now there's a new element, a giant demonstration. Some would use more strong language than that in Washington, D.C., people around the world wondering what's going on. We have always some elements of challenge. Do you see some of our institutions or some institutions in partnership with colleagues overseas being creative, being courageous, being really innovative in how they are tackling in an honest way these challenges or these potential barriers and finding ways to work with them to keep this movement, this is a global movement for international education, alive and growing stronger, even though we have these difficult times right now?
I was talking to somebody about this very topic, and she said to me, a lot of the way this is framed as how quickly can we get back to normal? And she said, I think we should think of this as how can we take this time, what is, there are international students here. I mean, many students could not leave. And so we do have international students in our institutions, but this is in some ways a pause. Can we take advantage of this terrible thing that's happened and use it to imagine, to think about, what could be? Can we think about ways that, about the future of international education, of exchange, of study abroad, of student mobility, in a way that many people in the field just didn't have the luxury because they were in the middle of doing. And so on study abroad, for example, one of the issues that has long plagued American study abroad, and that is sort of outbound Americans going to other countries, is they just don't. The numbers are very low. The percentage of college students who go overseas has been pretty stable for a long time. And if you accept, which I suspect most of the people who are joining us today do, that having an international experience or an intercultural experience is really critical to the kind of education that American universities want to deliver, how do you get that? And so, I see people experimenting with virtual study abroad, with sort of linking up their classrooms here in the US with overseas classrooms and co-teaching courses or having group projects in which students from different countries work together. They're thinking about, if not in the classroom, but could we use virtual exchange to give students internship experiences? Honestly, most of us are all working remotely now and connecting online, and could that be applied to the internship aspect? I think colleges are beginning to think, and this is something I should say, and for the most part, colleges have been having some of these conversations even prior to COVID, but they're beginning to think, okay, maybe if students don't or are hesitant to come to the US, are there ways that we can still deliver our education to them, students overseas, without expecting that they're going to come here for 4 years and earn a degree on American soil? Can we partner with universities overseas? Can we deliver our what we do remotely? Can we be creative and establish some form of if not a full institution, some kind of programs that students can go to? Can we think regionally and tap those kind of networks? And so I do think that at the beginning of the pandemic, it was kind of triage. We got to get our students back to campus. We have to ensure that our international students are safe and those who can get home. But now I think as the disease, as the pandemic has stretched, there is this sort of thinking more broadly about what do we want international education to look like into the future.
Well, so it's very hopeful for me to hear, this sort of transition or this sort of transformation over time. I know our organization has experienced this in many different areas. At first, how do you think? But then over time, you begin to say, well, we could reach people around the planet. We could bring in Karin Fischer from the West Coast. We can bring in the head of UNESCO like we did this morning. But I believe this moment now, it's taking that kind of hopeful, not being, unaware of all the difficulties and things that are going on, and beginning to say, let's start highlighting best practices. Let's start highlighting some innovators. Let's start reaching out and advertising the desire, the willingness, the mechanisms. Where does a day like International Day of Education, where there's things going on all over the planet, can we turn it into something that's like a global festival that then leads to these kind of connections? Are you seeing that? Because that seemed like a craziness, or does that seem like some place we are headed if we take ourselves there?
I think there's optimism among the people that I talk to that the commitment to doing this kind of work hasn't changed. It's just maybe the modes are. I talk to, for example, people who are in international student recruiting who say, look, I used to be on a plane for 3 months of the year, traveling around the world, talking to students and their families about why they might want to come to both the US and to my college. And yes, I'm missing out on doing that, and the way that you touch people and can have conversations on the ground are different. But I could only go to, in those weeks, I could only go to so many places. And now I'm having students reach out to me and join in my meetings and come from all, countries I've never traveled to, who we haven't had at our institution. And so maybe that makes me hopeful. And I do think there's a lot of commitment. I mean, I talk to people in international admissions who are getting up at 3:00 in the morning to talk to students, on the other side of the world. I talk to people in study abroad who are, planning ahead and trying to think about what it's going to look like. And as you say, I mean, I think in some ways COVID has made us all separate. We're all, in our homes and not able to really interact and see other people. But in some ways, it's reinforced the interconnectivity that we have.
I mean, you give me a lot of hope. I mean, I have to say, for much of my life, I would say if I had a magic wand, I would wave it, and every young person would have an overseas experience, if I could do one thing. But to then have the pandemic create such change. But now you're describing a way that young people at very young ages, but also, young adults, and that we all could be part of international connections. I remember I visited a school many years ago when I was Secretary of State here in Minnesota. And it was a classroom of 10th graders who were studying our bogs, part of our landscape. They were connected to a classroom in Siberia that was studying tundra and studying similar bogs, who also wanted to practice their English. And I was amazed, and I was like, wow, look at this. And I realized then, maybe that's not as cool as traveling and seeing, but that was pretty cool. And what you're helping me understand today is, if we are opening our minds and creativity and living with the reality, we will find new things that make it possible, not just for able-bodied people with enough money in their checking accounts to do this and that, but making it really possible for everybody, everywhere, a kind of universality. Is the international education movement, who really kind of had universality as part of its roots, is this going to be that rebirth and that re-energizing of that global movement?
You know, I think we're really at an inflection point. On one hand, it's been a tough, and it's not just COVID, it's been a tough few years here in America. There's been, I think, real questioning about the very principles that kind of underlie what we're talking about, the very values that the people who do this kind of work, espouse and feel deeply. There are Americans who question that, who would see us pull up our bridges and, not engage, and certainly COVID with has led to xenophobia and has, underscored, that there are people who would rather not engage with the kind of work that all of you do. And so that's on one hand. On the other hand, I think you could say that COVID has really underscored how connected we are, how internationalized we are, how finding problems to big challenges are truly global. And so in some ways, I think you could argue that it gives fuel and makes the case for why the work that you all do is important.
But it feels like young people have been energizing the leadership on many movements around equity, around climate, around gun violence. Just there's an energy coming from youth and young adults that I also hear in some of the conversations about education and about learning and about the future of learning. It may be that we're in that kind of inflection moment, as you described it, where the values that had to do with sort of learning and sharing and supporting a very small number of people able to move around the planet, welcoming them on steamships in New York was in the early days something that our organizations was part of supporting with people who went there from Minnesota, et cetera. But today, now that we know that we can all be touched by the same pandemic virus and all affected by the economic outcome of that, we can take some deeper understanding of the slogan we use a lot in Minnesota from our Senator Paul Wellstone. We all do better when we all do better. We all have the possibility now to be able to understand and to communicate and to share ourselves with others and to learn and be connected with them from overseas. It feels like a year from now, you and I should have another conversation, and we're optimistic enough maybe at that point we'd look back and say, wow, that hard period gave us the reminder to really think about where we're going, and these new tools gave us a chance to create a different kind of future, and the young people kind of dragged us along. We're running out of time for today's conversation, but I want to hear from you. People will be watching this interview over this whole next year, literally. What do you want them to be thinking about as you imagine this convergence and this inflection point taking us into a brighter future?
I would simply say that it's also about thinking about some of the hard realities of what the field has not done well. I mean, you mentioned a number of them, things like equity and access. And so as people use this sort of pandemic pause to think about what is international education going to look like in the future, maybe it can be a better future, one that answers the real challenges that we have and that engages many more of our students. I think that's the hope, and to do something that really can gives the next generation kind of the tools to equip them to live and shepherd a very global world.
Thank you so much, Karin Fischer. Thank you for your everyday watching and nurturing and lifting up international education, and for your time today, International Day of Education. And thank you for helping to create that brighter, better future for all the learners and for all of us at all ages. Listeners, stay tuned. We're looking deeper. We're looking wider. Hang in there. We'll be right back. Thank you again, Karin.